Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining today's event. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you joining online, also welcome. We're excited to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking and its final report. My name is Nick Hart. I lead the Bipartisan Policy Center's Evidence Project. And 1 year ago, we launched our evidence-based policymaking initiative specifically to help support pursuit of implementation for the recommendations that the Commission made when their final report was released. This work has been generously supported by the William T. Grant Foundation, the Laura and John Arnold Foundation, and Schmidt Futures, and we really appreciate their support. We're pleased today to have so many members of the Commission here in the audience, as well as a number of former Commission staff who all sat together. And honestly, we really appreciate all of their continued dedication and interest to the issues that the Commission made findings and recommendations about. We also applaud the leadership of Speaker Paul Ryan and Senator Patty Murray and their continued leadership in championing this cause along with their staff. Just recently here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we announced a new fellow. Ted McCann has joined us, and he was a senior policy advisor to Speaker Ryan. So the momentum behind the Commission's recommendations, as we've seen it, is quite strong. And this is really why we're very enthusiastic about upcoming progress. We've observed increased interest and attention in both generating and using evidence. And that's evidence that makes people's lives better, helps improve our businesses and our economy, and makes the country a better place to live and to work. We have a really jam-packed agenda this morning, and we're going to keep you all on your toes. And this is going to help back up the assertion that I've just made about the importance and the momentum that we've seen around the Commission's recommendations. The society that we live in today needs timely and objective and reliable and valid information. Good evidence is a critical ingredient to making good decisions. So this isn't just something that we talk about vaguely here. This event is called Evidence, A Time to Act, and in our minds today and now is the time to act. So members of Congress, the President, congressional staff, program managers, state legislatures, governors, and the entire American public all have a really important role to play in championing our ability to realize the vision of the Commission. We want and we need our policymakers to take steps that respect science, that respect statistics, that use research, and to genuinely and responsibly use evidence that makes our society better. So given the important issues that we face as a society, in our families, and our businesses, what could be more important? And we're biased in saying that. I'd now like to invite one of the great champions of evidence-based policymaking in our country to the stage, Ron Haskins, to get us started this morning. Ron was the co-chair of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking along with Catherine Abraham, and together they co-chair our evidence-based policymaking initiative here at BPC. Ron.
Thank you, Nick. Well, here we are again to members of the Commission and the staff. I've got a bunch of stuff I'd like the staff to start working on afterwards, like we've always had before. So I was especially glad to hear all the staff is coming. It's great that so many members of the Commission came. Some of them came from quite far away. I think that tells you how committed the members of the Commission are to the work. So it was 1 year ago that we released the report in that snug, I'll say, little room underneath the Capitol with Speaker Ryan and Senator Murray. And I think we released it to broad acclaim, not just in that room, but all around the country. There were very few criticisms, even of people who are widely known for criticizing database federal reports. So that was an encouraging sign. And then it flew through the committee without a single dissenting vote. That happens, all the time on the Hill now, as all of you know. And then it went to the floor of the House of Representatives and passed unanimously. And I think that whole thing took about 15 seconds after we released the report. So we were all extremely optimistic that this thing is a done deal. It'll go through the Senate. I had been on the Hill for 14 years, and I don't think I ever said aloud that something was just going to go right on through the Senate. And, of course, it didn't. It still isn't through the Senate. So we're hoping, though. We're optimistic. Nick, where'd Nick go? Nick, I think, accurately caught a a flavor of that optimism that all of us have that the Senate is going to pass it. The House has been relentless in helping, and staff in the Senate has also worked very hard. There are the kind of issues that are, hard to understand and that involve all kinds of stuff other than our report. As far as I know, the report itself there have been some issues about the report, but they can be easily taken care of. But there are broader issues that the report has gotten hung up, and we're still all somewhat optimistic that we'll be able to pass it before this session ends, which will be before July 4th next year. Think good things could still happen. The report that was released 1 year ago was aptly titled "The Promise of Evidence-Based Policymaking," and I would like to emphasize to this audience and to people who think about this that regardless of what happens in this report, the future of evidence-based policymaking is bright. A lot of good things are going on. There are many members of Congress on both sides of the aisle. One of the remarkable things about this is the number of Republicans that are playing a leadership role. So I am optimistic that we are going to have a bright future. But it would be much brighter if we could get various provisions of this report passed. I've always thought, their opinions differ, but the major goal of the report was to make as much evidence from the federal level available for research and for analysis as possible, and to somewhat lesser degree the same thing at the state level. And we have many provisions in the report that would do that, and especially would have an impact on OMB. I hope we hear about those in just a minute. But also the federal agencies are crucial in program evaluation, which I think is really probably the single biggest factor in building evidence-based policy. So I'm really optimistic that we will move ahead with or without the report. Nick, am I supposed to say that? But with the report, things will be much better. We'll be able to get more done. More data will be available. More people will figure out, what's going on, especially members of Congress, I hope. Catherine and I made these points yesterday in an op-ed that we wrote for The Hill. So no matter what happens, the future is bright. We can make it brighter. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker from the Office of Management and Budget. I always love introducing people from the Office of Management and Budget. It's one of the first things I learned in Washington. I'd been here, half hour or so, and I kept hearing about OMB, OMB, OMB. And then when I figured out what it was and watched what was going on, I thought, yeah, OMB, yeah, you got to figure out OMB and do what you can to work with OMB. So the speaker today now is going to be Margaret Weichert, who's the Deputy Director of Management at the Office of Management and Budget, a position she's held since February. I believe she came here from Atlanta. In 1999, she founded a financial company that developed secure online payment services, so she's well-versed in both the power of data and the need for privacy, which were big issues in the report, especially privacy. And in her current role, Margaret has been instrumental in formulating the President's management agenda with a focus on data strategy and making better use of information that the government already holds, as I've talked about before. So please join me in welcoming Margaret.
Thanks so much, everyone, for having me. And I really appreciate the warm introduction. I think this is a great topic. And I welcome the opportunity to join you today as you celebrate this one-year milestone. And I really applaud the efforts that you've done to build a community, build a set of recommendations, and start building capabilities to really drive the notion of data and evidence into the heart and soul of what we do in government. Honestly, when I got here and I heard about the report, because I got to DC about a year ago and the report had just come out, and the notion of the things in the report in a way stunned me, because I'm like, wait, isn't this like obvious? Isn't this how things work? I really didn't get that yet because I hadn't been in government before. I just thought, you focus on outcomes, you focus on results, you use data in order to inform good decision making. That's how I've always seen it done in business. And people reminded me, well, this town was really founded and runs on the law, and lawyers. And the nature of that profession isn't about numbers, it isn't about data, it's about passion and rhetoric. And those aren't bad things, but when you put them together and you arm passion and rhetoric and profound commitment with the actual facts, that is really the recipe for making change happen. And I came here, I think, on a wave in the country of belief that change is needed fundamentally in Washington and around the country. And frankly, that Washington needs to be more reflective of what the country actually wants and needs in the 21st century. So I and my colleagues across OMB, as well as across the Executive Office of the President, value your commitment and service to this mission and applaud the activities recommended in the report. I think the federal evidence community should sit quietly but foundationally in the center of every mission, helping ensure that we focus and appropriately align scarce financial resources to drive results for the American people. The members of the data and evidence communities work hard every day to ensure we bring modern, rigorous, evidence-based analysis to bear on the critical work of government, protecting our nation, growing our economy, and promoting our general welfare. The business of the federal government is to serve the American people, but we cannot perform that duty with outdated capabilities, technology, and we're not setting up our workforce here in government to meet the public's expectations by actually leveraging data to inform decisions. So we must change the way government operates and move our capabilities into the 21st century. Consequently, we moved earlier this year to release the President's management agenda to cement our commitment to enhancing and modernizing government in order to enhance mission, service, and stewardship. And that's why I'm thrilled to be here with you today to reiterate that the administration's perspective is that good government requires that decisions are rooted in and backed by evidence. So in formulating the President's management agenda itself, just like folks in the community focused on evidence, we leveraged data and rigorous analysis while we developed the President's management agenda. And so, I encourage people when I talk about it to actually read what we put together, look at some of the references we have in it. Similarly, when we rolled out the reorganization strategy, we included a bibliography so you could see what were the elements informing how we thought about the policy direction we were sharing. So by leveraging data and really looking at what were the problems and challenges to good government in the 21st century, we identified 3 key areas that were foundational to actually making change happen. One, everyone knows, IT modernization is critical. And this isn't a new thing, but it's a challenge to bring to bear. How do we pay for it? Because again, lawyers don't instinctively feel why we need to spend so much money on IT. Folks who deal with data understand that because of the second pillar, that data accountability and transparency in government require things that are really seemingly non-interesting to policy people. Things like taxonomy, data hygiene, good data structure, open data, APIs that allow data to go free. Those are things that are not intuitive to the traditional policy community, but they are critical to managing policy in a complex world in the 21st century. And last, and possibly most importantly, people and the workforce of the 21st century, by not connecting esoteric thoughts around IT and data to the people who have to leverage that, we have missed the opportunity to address, in some cases, the core roadblocks to making progress. Because if we don't give our people the tools and we don't actually connect to what people are used to working on and what they're accustomed to doing and how they're accustomed to doing it, and actually really understand what are the barriers for getting people to think about evidence, it's not that they're wrong-headed. It literally is, there's not enough hours in the day. There's too many tasks in front of them. They've got too much paperwork to handle to actually do the work that we are recommending in the report that you released last year. And so we have to be incredibly thoughtful about all those areas. Each of these drivers of modernization have implications for the federal evidence community, and in many ways echo the findings of the report itself. And there's specific evidence-oriented initiatives that we've actually baked into the President's management agenda, the reform plan and reorganization just released in June, and into budget recommendations in both the 2018 and 2019 President's budget. We strongly believe that evidence-based policy should be used to support mission, service, and stewardship of taxpayer funds. So I'm going to cover some of those key points of intersection today, and I've asked Nick to flag me down if I go too long, because it hopefully isn't surprising. I actually really care about this stuff. So the President's management agenda contains a vision for modernizing the government in key areas, as I mentioned. And because data are fundamental to achieving that vision, the comprehensive federal data strategy is actually one of the 3 gears that we are really focusing on and putting investments through cross-agency priority goals to actually articulate what is needed, make investments in these things, and continue to layer on policy with data so that we can focus and get investments in the right things. So to better use federal data for decision-making and accountability, including evidence-based decisions, we are looking at all of our programs and policies. We're looking at the things we do in OMB to drive accountability and transparency. We're looking at the data that agencies have, and we're asking questions like, how might we free that data up for better decisions in government, for the use in policymaking, but also for commercialization and the use of forwarding the mission by leveraging resources out of government. Co-creation, collaboration between what we know in government and what the private sector is doing is part of how we have to think about making decisions in the future. There's not enough money in government, given the entire, you look at the data, I call it the entitlement Pac-Man that's eating discretionary spending. You look at our finances, and it is clear there isn't enough money to do everything we're asking government to do. We have to look to the private sector to help work with us. We can set the agenda in government, but we need to free up data so that it is available for everyone to help drive things forward. One of my favorite examples, it's on my phone. Does anyone know what Pokemon Go is? Okay. So what does Pokemon Go have to do with evidence? Well, something that the private sector did leverages 3 data sets from government that nobody ever thought would be used to do Pokemon Go. GPS data, NOAA data, weather data, and monuments data. So 3 different departments have put data out in the private sector. Pokemon Go, it's a game. It's not that important. But GPS is today being used to create evidence around traffic incidences that affect health and welfare of other people. NOAA data saves lives and helps us refine science. And whether it's the Weather Channel or dark sky or Pokemon Go, we don't know in government what are all the applications that might make the lives of the American people better. And it's actually presumptuous to think that we could come up with all the use cases, all the ways that people could use the data associated with those data streams to really improve people's lives. So that's just one example. It's kind of a fun example because I'm addicted to Pokemon Go. But it reminds us, we don't corner the market on good ideas in government, but we have some of the best data that the private sector could leverage. We also need to spur technological solutions that make it easier for people to tap into this data. We need to transform how Americans interact with the federal government, providing modern, streamlined, and customer-centric experiences for citizens, businesses, and other customers. The data show that customer satisfaction with federal service lags significantly behind other industries, as measured by the American Customer Satisfaction Index, causing frustration for customers and higher costs for the federal government. There are small pockets in government doing this well, but when customers interact across government, they end up having bad experiences. And these result in other sets of evidence about how people don't trust government. Pew Research data was actually a critical part of what we looked at when we looked at the president's management agenda. And the American people believe we should be doing most of the things we're doing in government. They just don't think we're doing a very good job. To me, that should be the foundation in our agencies of driving how do we think about that service angle of what we're doing. For many years, small businesses have been frustrated by slow, bureaucratic, paper-based processes at the SBA. And SBA dug in and looked at the data, partnered with technology team members, and focused on user-centered design with teams such as the U.S. Digital Service team that's housed in OMB. And now small businesses can apply for government contracting programs online in about an hour instead of days. They can secure information about locating their businesses using mapping applications that also help them after floods. So real time after Hurricane Harvey last year, this new capability and the data allowed us to identify, did people qualify for special assistance, so they could get back up and running and contributing to the economy of Texas in a very critical time. Data was at the heart of figuring out how to improve service and how to deliver service, and then actually how to get benefits to the required affected recipient areas, essentially creating this virtuous cycle around all of those elements. These are examples of what we have done and evidence of the fact that we can do this if we focus and bring things together. So we wanted to sort of up the ante around this, and we created a cross-agency priority goal for customer experience to do the exact same thing across government. So bring data to bear on customer experience use cases to drive real results and improve experiences around mission, service, and stewardship. Last month, or 2 months ago, excuse me, in June, when we released the President's Reform Plan and Reorganization recommendations, everybody was sort of expecting this was going to be a goal of the administration to gut federal workers. And I surprised Congress and I said, well, no, we actually looked at the evidence of what federal workers are doing and where we have federal workers, and we don't actually have a problem of too many federal workers. We have a problem that within 10 years, 60% of our federal workforce is eligible to retire. That's what the data says. Within 3 years, something like 40% are eligible to retire. I don't have a problem of too many feds. I have a problem of a gap between 30 and 40-year-olds of people with the skills I need for the 21st century, the right programming skills, the right statistical analysis skills, the right cyber skills, and law enforcement. I have a problem not with my newcomers and not with my long-timers. People with families in the middle, we can't retain. So when I look at the data, I come to very different conclusions than a broad policy strategy. It's bad business to be thinking about, looking at the workforce as a place for efficiencies. We have to look at the workforce to drive value for the American people. We have to look at the workforce to do these compelling things that we have to do. So I need to transform how we think about it, and data is a key part of that. We need to improve access, make it easier for our employees to get the evidence, to do their jobs easily. We shouldn't put walls up that make it hard, and that requires funding. So I need this community to help me talk to people about what it takes from a an infrastructure standpoint to deliver evidence to the people who need to use it, so that it isn't a monumental task that's nearly impossible for people to do in their day jobs and do all the paperwork that we're working on fixing as well. So I haven't forgotten about that part. We also need to strengthen government's ability to use the data. And I talked about the challenge we have with the workforce not being how many, but what skills do people have. We need to get people educated in how to use evidence, how to use data in what they're doing. And one way to do this is for agencies to establish and utilize multi-year learning agendas, which are a powerful tool that allow agencies to strategically plan how they educate their workforce to give them the skills of the future over a multi-year period. We've also announced, and have not received funding from Congress, but $1 billion workforce fund to focus on retention, reward, and recruitment. But as part of that, we want to have a very strategic, evidence-based method for ensuring that we're aligning people and the skills they need to succeed in the 21st century, rather than what we have today, which is evidently, the evidence shows it's a system that was in alignment effectively in the 70s. So the skills our workforce have today are well aligned to the tasks and missions of a very long time ago. We need to change that. We've brought evidence to bear in putting together proposals for reorganization. In some areas, we noted that evidence of program effectiveness was lacking and identified opportunities specifically to strengthen the evidence and improve performance on some of these programs. A lot of people, again, when we released the reform plan, thought, this is like a big policy, philosophically driven, plan to, do all kinds of things we were thought to do. But when we actually look at the evidence of where there are challenges, and we didn't have to look far. GAO has written tons of evidence-based reports, so I didn't have to go very far. I had a stack of them from GAO that frankly not enough people read the reports that come out up there with evidence of duplication in government, evidence about critical functions we're not doing an appropriate job at. And again, this seemed like a surprise to many of the lawyers here in this town, but it shouldn't be a surprise to you that I would take the evidence that other people have collected, because that's actually pretty efficient. I don't have to do all the research myself. I can build on what has gone before. That's actually the core of the scientific method. I don't have to do every experiment. I start with the experiments that have already been done. I start with the evidence. So that is critical to getting efficiency. We don't have to recreate things every 4 years. I think that's been another surprise, that we didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater on a lot of the elements of the management agenda. These are fundamentally bipartisan issues. It would be foolish to throw out good practices that were put into place in a previous administration. That's just not good business. So that's another area, I think, where we're thinking differently. In program effectiveness, we identified more than 20 different agencies offering some type of financial education or literacy program. So this came out of the analysis we did, and the federal government was spending in excess of $250 million annually. That's just one example. Director Mulvaney was on TV talking about the fish swimming upstream and all the duplication of regulation in that space. We have evidence of what that actually costs taxpayer. So the diffuse nature of programs across government make it difficult to do this type of analysis. We need your help to think about how do we do this systematically, routinely, and not in order to crush people's dreams, but to amplify them, to make them better. Just because financial literacy is happening in these diffuse places doesn't mean that there isn't some higher goal that we could all achieve together. It doesn't need to sit in only one agency. So we need to think about that. Lack of clear measures, lack of transparency, lack of visibility are part of the root causes about why these things, these programs, proliferate, and we don't actually know which of these programs are most effective. We have the same thing with workforce reskilling activities, something like 40 plus programs across 15 agencies, and very few of them have any metrics at all about outcomes. So we spend all kinds of money trying to redeploy skills in our broader economy to help vulnerable populations, but we don't have the same level of consistency about metrics on that. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention two other important efforts underway where evidence is being used as a tool to improve policy and program design. Implementing the cross-agency monitoring and evaluation guidelines for foreign assistance that OMB issued in January 2018. This was a direct response to a lack of quality information about what foreign assistance dollars are achieving. In partnership with Treasury, OMB is implementing the Social Impact Partnerships for Pay for Results Act, SIPRA, enacted earlier this year, and has a focus on rigorous evaluation to determine whether a project was successful. As with all pay-for-success programs, the underlying idea here is that government should be paying for results. In order to achieve our vision for an effective and modern government, we need your support and engagement. We have an RFI right now out. I think it closes next week, so we're trying to get information for something that was in the Reform and Reorganization Plan, the GEAR Center, for Government Effectiveness Advanced Research. And some people might notice that I use GEARS as my focus point in the President Management Agenda, so one of my teammates came up with this great acronym. But the advanced research piece is core to this concept. We want academia, we want private sector thinking, and government challenges and problems and experience to come together in a place outside of government. And why outside of government? Because we believe that academia and the private sector can be a catalyst for the change we need in government, and we in government can be the catalyst and the area of prioritization to focus the learning agendas. You know, the Department of Defense does a great job creating ecosystems that have virtuous elements to them. So the private sector does at-risk research, hard science and applied research on their dime. They do the test and learn far before DOD is asked to pay for anything. And so we get bandages that help soldiers survive in the field at much greater rates. We get prosthetics that work to give people back functional, very effective lives once those bandages have saved their lives, but they lose a limb. A lot of that research, that at-risk, hard science, evidence-based research was not paid for by taxpayer money because there was an ecosystem that could get that great information back to government when it was ready for prime time. I want to do that across government, across policy areas. And so this GEAR Center is a vision for that. And so we've invited academics and institutions, you know, from MIT to Florida State, from, you know, Kansas State University to Stanford to participate in this. But we want public policy and good governance folks to be involved in that, to help guide and steer and remind people how things work in Washington. We want this community, and yes, we want private sector money to help fund a lot of this research. And then we need in government to figure out how to, in the 21st century, we bring those innovations back into government. You know, the structure of many of our laws, things in the federal acquisition regulation, things in our contracting rules make it difficult to bring things in, make it difficult to test and learn. I've got all kinds of private sector software as a service companies who want to give me things to test. I can't take them. I can't take those gifts. And there are entities in this town who have gift authority who can take gifts of licensed software, but can't take gifts of services because we haven't updated that law. So this is a flavor of the kind of thing that I think changes how we talk about these boring plumbing aspects of government. I don't think they're boring. I think that it's fascinating. I think it's the foundation of how change actually happens. And a lot of people aren't up for the hard work that's involved there, but I know this community is up for that hard work. Evidence, scientific method, research, and learning are all about trying, learning, and then actually measuring the results. So I thank you for what you do and appreciate your time.
Margaret, thank you very much for the remarks. And I know you have to run to another event, but before you leave, I just want to say thank you truly for all of your leadership at OMB and your support for the movement and evidence-based policymaking. So keep up the good work.
Great.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite Ken Trotsky to the stage. Ken is a former member of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, and he's going to talk about workforce development. Come on up.
Thank you, Nick. Before beginning, I guess I would like to thank Nick and the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me to give these remarks today. I'm also thrilled to be back here. It's great to see the staff that we had as part of the commission for so long. It was a fantastic staff that really improved our work and what we did, and we could not have succeeded without them. So it's great to see the staff that are here, and it's also great to see my fellow commissioners. We spent a lot of time together over a 15-month period, and then all of a sudden it stops, and you sort of feel like you're kind of leapt off a cliff because you missed a lot of these people, and they were a great asset to me. They helped me learn a lot about. I thought I knew a lot about evidence-based policymaking, but I learned so much more as part of this commission. So thrilled to see my fellow commissioners here with me today, so. I want to talk a little bit about some of my work in using data to try to examine the performance of the federal workforce training programs. This is something that I've spent a fair amount of time on in my career, and I appreciate the previous remarks about some of the importance of the workforce training programs, because I do think they're very important, and I also think it's very valuable to continue to. What we call in business, I teach business for my day job, and one of the things I focus on is continuous improvement, and try to implement that in some of these programs as well. So basically, I want to discuss the usefulness of using administrative data by discussing two projects that I've worked on in the past. In an effort to try to improve the efficiency of job training programs in this country. The first was a project that was funded by the Department of Labor, project that we started in 2007 to examine the impact of federal job training programs on participant earnings and the probability of employment. At that time, the job training program was called WIO, Workforce Investment Act. It's now called WIO, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, I think is what WIO stands for. And Ted's shaking his head saying I got it right, so that's great. The job training program, as many of you probably know, has gone through this is about the 6th or 7th different acronym since its initiation a number of years ago. The second project I want to talk about is a project where my co-authors and I, and both of these are involved with several other co-authors, examine the impact of passing the GED, again, on an individual's employment, earnings, and probability of entering post-secondary education. So the first program, essentially, where we examine the impact of job training on the individuals who participated in it, we got administrative data on both participants in the job training program and then people who did not actually participate in job training program. And essentially using statistical methods, we combined these two and created both a sample of people who participated and then a sample of people who were statistically similar who had not received job training programs, and then compared outcomes for these two groups of individuals just to basically measure the performance. The WIA job training program, there are 3 groups. We focused on 2, what's called adult workers and dislocated workers. Adult workers are essentially economically disadvantaged workers who've faced barriers to employment over a number of years, often single moms with kids that struggle to get to work, people who are recovering from various abuse problems. And then the second group is the dislocated workers, or workers who had a job but lost a job in a mass layoff. And so we were tasked, the third group was youths, and we were not asked to examine youths. So we were tasked to examine the performance of these two groups. The graphs sort of focus on the impact on earnings of participating in job training programs for these groups. The red lines are for women, the blue lines are for men. We did the analysis separately by gender. The group on the left, I think it's, yeah, your left, the adult workers, you can see that the participating in job training, we're measuring earnings. That's what's on the y-axis, and quarters since they started the program is on the x-axis. And you can see that for adult workers, participating in the job training program had a fairly profound and long-term impact on earnings. Essentially, they saw increases of earnings of somewhere between $400 and, I'm not going to go with $1,200, but we'll go with $800 over the course of approximately 4 years. So a pretty large, a fairly substantial increase in quarterly earnings for most of these individuals, an increase that was statistically significant, and I will mention an increase that is greater than the actual cost of sending these individuals through the training program based on some evidence about what it cost. In contrast, for dislocated workers, you see that for the dislocated workers, the job training had a much smaller and actually not significant impact on their earnings. It just simply wasn't particularly effective for these workers who went through that training program. And so we found similar impacts for probability of employment. And so one of the outcomes of this was Congress has, based on this and some other work that has been done to find similar things, Congress has moved towards providing workforce training programs with the flexibility to easily move monies that were allocated to dislocated workers into their adult worker program. And many of them across the country that I'm aware of do this on a regular basis because of the evidence suggesting that the adult worker programs are seemingly more effective. I should also mention, we started this program in 2005. We finished it in a year and a half at the cost of $1.5 million. Simultaneously, they launched a random control trial to evaluate the WIA and then the WIOA program in 2007. So that was 11 years ago. Just this year, they released the initial estimates, the 15-month estimates of the program, and that program cost $23 million. So, I would say both types of researches are important, but one of the advantages of what we did is it can be done fairly quickly and relatively less expensively, but it requires administrative data. There's just no way you can do it without the data that we had. One of the disadvantages is much of this data is collected by the state, and when the Department of Labor sent out a request that states provide us with data, we managed to get data from 13 of the 50 states. And 12 data from 12 states was actually usable, so that's what we ended up using in our study. So it would have been nice if we had a much more broad and comprehensive access to state data. Second program I want to mention briefly is another work that I've done with co-authors looking at the impact of passing the GED on earnings and employment. In this program, we took administrative data on GED test takers, compared those that passed to those that didn't pass, right around that threshold, and basically found that passing the GED, again, on this graph, I have quarterly earnings on the y-axis and quarters since they took the GED on the x-axis, and you can see very, very small impacts of passing the GED on individual earnings. Essentially, that's not to say the GED isn't valuable for some people, but the results from this study suggest that overall, the GED has sort of a minimal at best impact on individual earnings or probabilities of employment. Why is this important for the workforce development system? Well, it turns out that for most people who if you walk into a career center around the country as part of the workforce development system and you're a high school dropout, they urge you to get a GED. That's the first thing that they primarily do. And these results suggest that there may be better uses of their time than taking the time and effort to study and pass a GED, perhaps some training in health. The allied health industries or training in the construction industry, all of which other research suggests has had a pretty profound impact on earnings, would be a better use of their time. So let me conclude, since I think I'm out of time. I would say, I think, based on my own research, administrative data are invaluable for adopting this continuous improvement idea, this ability to always work on improving the efficiency of these programs, which is a standard technique in business, but much less used in government. But to do so, you need access to the administrative data. There's no other two ways about it. And I think the recommendations that the Commission issued around access to data and the protection of data are important, particularly for these programs in which we have a federal-state cooperation, and often it's difficult to get states to provide data to researchers to continue to evaluate the effectiveness of the program. So, and of course, we always need to do this in a way that ensures data protection, and I think our report that we issued has some very profound and important recommendations for how that gets done. So, thank you.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Ken. So I'd like to go ahead and invite the first panel up to the stage. There's a lot of really innovative work happening inside the federal government today, and there's a lot of innovative work happening for folks working with the federal government. So you've just heard a great example from Ken, who has been doing evaluations around workforce development for many years. And a lot of the work that folks like Ken do would be made much easier if the Commission recommendations were fully implemented. But we know there's already a lot of progress happening within some agencies and across the federal government. You heard Margaret offer some remarks about that this morning. But we want to highlight some of the really specific things that are happening inside government in the course of this panel. So I'm excited to be joined by three individuals who have some pretty exciting projects happening in their respective work. To my immediate left, Naomi Goldstein, who's a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families. Tim Gribben, who's the Chief Financial Officer at the Small Business Administration and also the Associate Administrator for Performance Management. And to his left, Dave Archer, who is a Principal Scientist at Galois, is a firm that is working with some of our defense agencies. So thank you all for joining. I want to start by just having a little bit of discussion about some of the big picture around the Commission's recommendations. So Naomi, if we could start with you. So you're really familiar with the Commission recommendations. We've been on panels together over the course of the last year. What has this meant for your work in ACF? Did the recommendations resonate with your team?
So, yes. I would say the Commission's recommendations have validated some things that we are already doing, as well as, frankly, our existence. So validated the idea of evaluation as a function and an important function. And the recommendations have also given us a push to up our game in some other areas. So some of the areas that I think were already strengths for us that are validated by the Commission's report include a long history of conducting rigorous evaluations, an evaluation policy that establishes the principles of rigor, relevance, transparency, independence, and ethics to guide our work. The fact of my position existing, a position of Deputy Assistant Secretary for Planning, Research, and Evaluation, which is like a Chief Evaluation Officer at the sub-cabinet level, so mirrors one of the recommendations of the Commission's report. And a skilled and committed evaluation workforce. Those are all some areas that I think where we're already strong, but it always helps to have validation from a prestigious bipartisan commission. And then I'll save the details for the next question, but some of the areas where the Commission's report has pushed us to make more progress are areas related to improving the quality and use of administrative data, and we do have some exciting work underway there, but I'll save it for the next question.
So I like this. We all like validation in our work, right? Tim, what about at SBA? What have you seen?
Yeah, so at SBA, we didn't have the long history of evaluation like Naomi, but we have changed a lot in the last 2 years. When Margaret talked about GAO, there's a lot to be said about the evidence that they provide. And one of them was that they did a general management study of SBA and said that we needed to do more we need to devote more resources to program evaluation, similar to one of the recommendations of the Commission. And that is so in 2016 is when we inaugurated our central evaluation unit with one lead evaluator. And then in 2017, we added a second one. Now, I house that with my performance management office to say there's different kinds of evidence. Some evidence you get from performance management and other evidence you get from evaluation. One of the things that also piggybacks on the commission was talking about an enterprise learning agenda, and that is something that we have definitely embraced. We created our first enterprise learning agenda, and we asked what are those questions that we want to answer in the next 4 years. We structure it with our strategic plan, and we published it with our new strategic plan in February as a joint document as well as a standalone document. And then the other recommendation that also resonates with me is about the Chief Evaluation Officer. Now, I said we have the 2 lead program evaluators, and we're working now on creating a structure. We will have also a Chief Evaluation Officer by creating a kind of a division of analysis and evaluation within performance management.
Cool. That's great. So Dave, turning to you, you've done a lot of work in the privacy area, specifically around technologies. So what have you seen happen over the last year since the commission report came out? Is there more interest in some of the things that you spend your time and energy on?
So definitely there. I think, one of the things that Margaret said, she talked about the 3 uninteresting facets of data being brought to bear on policy. I would add a 4th, which is privacy. And there's been a tremendous uptake in across governments. I've seen anywhere from census to defense to intelligence, the idea that we need to use administrative data to make decisions, as Ken said, and as Margaret alluded to as well, but that we need to be sensitive to that data, that it has privacy implications for the individuals who the data is about. And that's what I've seen an uptick in, is the interest in how do we do these analytics over data to make such decisions while protecting the privacy of the individuals involved. So bringing technology to bear there, especially through defense funding, is a place that I've been doing a lot of work.
Very good. So Tim, you mentioned learning agenda at SBA. Can you tell us a little bit about, has anyone requested data as a consequence of you all putting out a learning agenda? Has it achieved its goal?
It has. So one has achieved its goal by helping to focus the attention within the agency on what are those chief questions that we want to answer to help make our programs more effective, more efficient, and also to make sure we're delivering the value to our customers. But one of the benefits that we hadn't thought of before was that when Margaret talked about, and it's also part of the Commission's report, is about the external research. And we have had a lot of interest in our external research to help supplement what SBA does internally. And so some examples of that is currently we're working with Wharton on a study. There's a number of different authorities, and so Margaret was talking about authorities, and we looked at different authorities that we could use to help other researchers get access to our data. So with Wharton, we're using our co-sponsorship authority. They have access to insurance data that we don't have. We have access to the disaster loan data that they don't have. And then together, they're asking research questions on what is the benefit of loans versus insurance in helping an economy recover after a natural disaster. Another example is with the Golub Center at MIT. So they approached us after the learning agenda was published and said, we have an interest in doing a research project, an evaluation of your microloan program. And our microloan program is loans that go to the smallest of small businesses. It's combined with technical assistance and training. And they said, we would like to do a research project. Well, it's taken a while. So in terms of figuring what's the right authority to use to give them access to the data to do this project for us. And we went through, working with general counsel, different authorities. We ended up with our student volunteer authority. So they have their graduate student is now a student volunteer at SBA doing the research. So that has just started the work as of August 27th. It took a long time to work through those processes. And then, so another thing I'll also talk about is and I have to remind myself, it's the Alabama Center for Insurance Information and Research. So they wanted to do a study and combine with a couple other universities on what was how are businesses in Texas recovering after Harvey? And that's not necessarily a program evaluation, but it's a research study that they're approaching us saying that we know that this is of an interest to you based on some of the questions that you've asked as part of your learning agenda. So one of the things that I'll end on saying is that one of the biases internally within SBA that I also had to address was, well, why would SBA want to give up control if it's not something that we're doing under contract? And because I was saying, I was asked a question, well, why would we do some of these things? I said, well, one, it's non-biased, and two, it's free, which I always like free. And the response I got back from somebody was, well, I was afraid you were going to say that. And I said, but this is the direction that the government should be going down. And SBA is also one of the co-leads of the CAP goal for data that Margaret was talking about. This is directly in line with what we should be doing, providing access to our data to researchers. And I'll end by saying that's one thing we've been working with Census on, an MOU that would provide Census with all of our loan data, from our business loans as well as our disaster loans, that then researchers could gain access to it. So that it's not just relying on the federal government to do its own internal research, but also looking out to the community based on the questions that the community has. They might not be the same questions that we have, and therefore that's been a learning experience for us.
So needless to say, there's a lot of great work happening at SBA. Yeah. So this is really great to hear. I want to turn next to Naomi. I also hear there's a lot of great work happening at ACF. So you have taken on this effort to do something that a lot of agencies have really struggled with for years around building better data inventory so we can communicate what data exists. Having metadata, not the sexiest thing out there in the world, but a really important one if we want to do good research. Tell us how this is going. What's happening at ACF?
So 2 years ago, which predates the Commission's report, we established a new division of data and improvement with a dual mission. So one was to improve the quality, the relevance, the use, and the sharing of administrative data for internal and external statistical uses, very much in line with the Commission's recommendations. And then the companion mission of that division is what we call interoperability, which is improving the ability of data systems at the federal, state, and other levels to communicate with each other, to exchange individual level information for programmatic purposes. So not so much up the alley of the Commission's work, but an important mission nevertheless. So that division is still staffing up, still aiming to get to full performance level, but has already done a number of things, including developing a compendium of survey and administrative data at ACF, which we've distributed for internal use and hope to be publishing for external use soon.
Great. So in the vein of human services, Dave, I want to turn next to you. So today, just earlier this morning, the Bipartisan Policy Center has announced that we're launching a new multi-party computation project. So this is a privacy-preserving data analysis technology, and it's specifically a partnership with Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, and their Human Services Department. And I mean, we're really excited that this is, as far as we know, the first deployment of the technology in human services. And Dave, your firm is of course helping to launch the project. Can you tell folks here a little bit about the project, what multi-party computation is, and,
Sure.
and why it matters here?
Sure. So, we talked about the idea of the importance of sharing data, like you were talking about, and we talked about the importance of the idea of repurposing data, administrative data, for making decisions. But what comes with that kind of data is often that data will include facets that aren't key to a particular analysis and are so maybe more sensitive than some others about being revealed as part of the analysis. There are things that researchers don't need to know. And in fact, they are put themselves at risk or at risk of liability for knowing if, for example, they have a data set and there's parts of that data that are very sensitive and contain personally identifiable information. If that gets hacked in the popular terminology or stolen from whoever is holding it doing research on it, that can lead to trouble for everyone. So we've been working on this notion of technologies that can allow people to, let me say it real briefly, compute on data without ever seeing the data. So I'm going to, a picture always helps when it comes to technology. Let me see if we can get a picture on the screen here. No, that's the other way. So there's a picture here that might help. The notion is that there are many organizations in the government that have data. Census has data. IRS has data about income. VA has data about health outcomes. It helps to be able to take all that data, be able to compute over it, find the information necessary to make policy and other decisions, and then reveal just the part that is applicable to those decisions, so that the rest of the data is never available. In fact, none of the data is ever available in the clear, we'd call it, to the people using it. So the technology we're talking about, multi-party computation, is one of a small family of technologies where we can do exactly that. We can essentially keep data encrypted and in the hands of the people who own the data or know how to take care of it, know what it means, and then share it only in this encrypted form so that it can be shared, it can be computed on with other similarly encrypted data, and then researchers can get access to it. Researchers can ask questions of the data, draw conclusions from the data, but yet they never see the data in the clear. They never see the data in unencrypted form. So you might look at this as the idea of a set of data where you may have information on ages and mental or health outcomes and incomes, and you'd like to be able to ask interesting questions about that in terms of how to allocate public resources. If that data remains encrypted, yet we can ask those questions and find out these statistically interesting answers, then we have a chance of making policy-based decisions without risking the privacy of the individuals. I won't go into the crypto details here, because that's a bit
appreciate
complicated.
That.
But the idea is basically that the data is split into pieces that alone are unidentifiable and make no sense to anybody looking at them, but can be combined together with the use of several computers in parallel that talk to each other only in encrypted ways, and those computers together can answer these questions without revealing the data.
So if you want the crypto details, feel free to follow up later. Why is this so hard to do? Why don't we see more deployment of this approach across government, across the country today?
Well, it's only been in the past, let's say, 8 years that there's been an emphasis on making this kind of computation practical. It tends to still be, today, slow compared to other computation, the other things you might run on a normal computer. It tends to take space, and it tends to take a level of expertise that most programmers don't have. So today you could say that this kind of application is something that only a small group of people worldwide could actually do. We're working right now with the intelligence organizations to try to bring that forward to the place where it's easier to use. But there's a long way to go. With any new technology adoption, most technologists will say adoption of a new technology may take 20 or 25 years. We're maybe 10 years into this technology in a practical sense. It's going to take another 10 to get there. What we're trying to do now is, with the help of federal funding, accelerate that so that we can bring this to bear not 15 years from now, but 2, 3, 5 years from now. But it's that lack of expertise combined with the inefficiencies we're trying to overcome that still makes it somewhat less than the popular software package you would buy off the shelf.
Yeah. So you mentioned expertise is a critical component here, and Naomi, you also alluded to the Division of Data Analytics doing some staffing up and really trying to bring in expertise. What other kinds of challenges are you facing as you sort of engage in this work inside ACF? Are there like really obvious things that are relevant for the group to know?
Sure. I'm so glad you asked that question. I would like to mention 3 types of challenges. So one, ACF may be more than many agencies, but probably similar to many agencies, is a very diverse and decentralized place, and we manage programs with many distinct legislative authorities. So doing anything agency-wide is a challenge. So we hope to develop agency-wide procedures for sharing administrative data with researchers and others for statistical uses, including risk assessments and privacy protections as recommended by the Commission, but we have to get there program by program, and that's a challenge. Although perhaps the National Secure Data Service will be stood up and will do this for us, so that would be fine. Second, I wanted to mention a couple of challenges that were highlighted by the Commission's report. One is the lengthy process of approval that's required to be able to collect information, the Paperwork Reduction Act requirements, and the second being constraints in federal procurement processes. So those are really kind of beyond our ability to change, although we aim to be savvy about how we navigate those processes. And then the last challenge is both a challenge and an important mission. But the increasingly strict and rapidly changing standards for data security are a huge challenge. So, of course, we're for it, but it means we're having to learn new concepts and new language. So we have staff who are perhaps trained as child developmentists or sociologists or trained in economics. And they've already gotten to be experts on federal procurement and the Paperwork Reduction Act, and now they're having to learn an entirely new field, an entirely new set of language related to authorizations to operate, infrastructure as a service, multi-factor authentication. All of these things are very important, but the infrastructure to help us figure that out is itself sort of growing and changing at the same time that we're trying to become familiar with it. And some of these new requirements and processes, and again, I don't mean to say it's unimportant, it's very important, but they're also very burdensome and time-consuming and confusing.
So I didn't hear in your list, though I maybe just missed it, data standards. There's been a lot of work in some legislative vehicles, including this year. The Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018 included some modifications to child welfare that had data standards built in. What's happening and how complicated is it to implement some of those data standards that you're seeing happen legislatively? Mm-hmm.
So yes, so we have a new statutory requirement to develop data exchange standards related to child welfare and TANF and child support. And so the statutory requirement is to regulate in those areas. So all I will say is that yes, we are moving ahead to comply with those statutory requirements. More broadly, data exchange standards are exciting and also require an extremely detailed approach. If if you want different databases to be able to communicate, even though this database has last name, comma, first name, middle name, and the other database has first name, space, middle name, space, last name, you got to actually develop a data exchange standard that says how those things are going to be, are going to communicate with each other. So conceptually, it's very exciting, and then getting it done, you just kind of have to slog through those details.
And they're important details to get right, though.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, I want to turn back to you to probe a little bit more on the challenges around the learning agenda, and you described setting up a chief evaluation office role. Why haven't these happened in the past? Why did they take so long to develop at SBA? That's not a critique. But what were the real challenges in actually getting it done?
I would say, I always think, and this is of course just according to my perspective, and so others at SBA may disagree, but the philosophy used to be that you had to do these long, expensive, drawn-out program evaluations, and they had to be all-encompassing. We changed the model to say we're going to ask specific questions, we're not going to ask all the questions, and it's going to be a continual process, so a program is not going to go through one comprehensive evaluation, but multiple evaluations. That shift, I think, in cultural think led to why, one, SBA wasn't doing it in the past, but also why we've switched to it now. The challenges has been that we don't have a lot of money and we don't have a lot of resources. So even to do this, I had to carve out, I didn't get extra FTEs in my complement in order to start this evaluation unit. I had to carve it out of existing vacancies, existing FTEs, and I'd say when one of the other shifts is looking at how do you shift from low value to work to high value work. So we've been trying to shift to more high value work, and as we're doing that, I am leveraging those FTEs to create this. And somebody had to step up to the plate and say, I'm willing to do this, and that's what we did in the CFO's office. So the other challenge, I think, has been with publishing the learning agenda is then by doing these smaller research efforts, we're not answering all the questions. So then sometimes people come and say, well, what about this and what about that? Well, we'll get to that. This is not a comprehensive evaluation. And I'll say one thing that tie on to what you said, and that's with the PRA requirements. So as we're trying to do these shorter evaluations at a lower cost, and we're trying to combine qualitative and quantitative research, we've been doing the qualitative research by only interviewing 9 because it takes too long to get the approval. We would be waiting 4 to 6 months to even start an evaluation, and that's too much time for what we're trying to do. So, so we've gotten some criticism that, well, how representative are the 9 that were picked? And that's a valid critique, and I get that. So we're hoping that things will change and it will be easier to get approved, especially we're not asking questions that I think that the Act was originally designed to reduce the burden on survey recipients. So I think that, but the one thing that I would flip to say, one of the, not a challenge, but one of the things that we've decided we're going to do moving forward is, as I said, we created our first learning agenda. We did that in-house. It was a coordinated approach by working with all of the program offices. We are planning on doing an update, and we'll be publishing that in February with our next budget submission. But this time we also want to reach out to the community, to our stakeholders, and then see what questions they might have that then could help us inform our learning agenda as we move forward.
So what's the most important advice you could offer for folks and agencies that are interested in starting down this path that SBA recently took around the learning agendas and the evaluation officers? Where do they start?
I would say I would start by, one, hiring somebody who knows what they're doing, and that's what we did. And, but also helping to start. So what he did was came in and did some benchmarking with a number of different agencies. So I think it was over 40 different agencies or 30 different agencies and 50 people, but leveraged what other agencies are already doing. So I'm willing to share what we've learned, and I'm willing to provide that to other agencies. And then also, I would say, building the culture within. So I only have 2 people that are the lead program evaluators. They can't do it all. So what we had to do was make sure that others in the agency understand what this means and how to go about doing it. So we created a community of practice where we have representatives from the different program offices learning about what's the taxonomy on program evaluation, what's the methodology, how to do logic models. So we hadn't done logic models before, and now we're doing logic models, and not just the evaluators, but my performance management people are working in the program offices to map that out, which also helps inform the questions that we need to ask to make our processes more efficient or to make sure that we're achieving the outcomes that we expect. So I would say it's a long answer, but hiring the right people, setting up a way to change the corporate culture and set the contract vehicles in place that we can do this.
All right, great. Same question, Dave. In the privacy context, for agencies that are interested in really making progress in demonstrating, piloting things like multi-party computation, some of the other technologies that the Commission recommended for exploration, where do you think they start based on what you've seen in the defense sector? Are there clear ways that they can help move that work along?
I think there are. I think the most important thing is to try it. Build a prototype. Don't assume you'll deploy a technology like this broadly right away, or rather prove its worth, right? Find one of those relatively small number of organizations that can do this kind of work and work with them, like we're doing with Allegheny County and with the new work with BPC, to build a prototype, demonstrate what can be done, and then figure out, does that do what we really need? Can we assess it? Can we attack it and make sure that it still preserves the privacy we want? And then if so, you take the next step. You do a pre-production unit where you're actually using some live data and with limited access and seeing, does that serve the need? And then you expand from there. It has to be a step-by-step growth to get there. The technology exists. We have to evaluate it carefully because it's not technology that applies easily to every kind of analysis you'd want to do. Mm-hmm. So this notion of try it on something you're really interested in and have a problem with you'd like to solve, see how it works, and go from there, and evaluate every step of the way. Again, it's nothing more than evidence-based decision-making, right? Evidence of the experiments you do bearing on how you proceed.
So I think I've heard each of you say some variation of start somewhere and start making progress. And I think that's a great message for the audience and a great message for the broader evidence movement that we're talking about. So we have a few minutes for questions. So I want to open it up to the audience for folks in the room. If there are any questions, we'll turn first to Ron Haskins.
Okay, so first,
And Ron, can you use the mic for the folks online?
as a member of the commission, it's so gratifying to see the two federal agencies that they're already in the midst of things that were along the lines of our report, and they're branching out. They're doing more and more. And some of them appear to be taken right out of the pages of the report. And I knew that was going to happen. Once we said this is the way to go, the federal agencies would do it. So there's all kinds of creativity and ability in the federal agencies. I know ACF a lot better, but they've always set the example. So this is extremely encouraging. Let me ask this question. It's a more technical question, but the ACF and HHS in general has spent a lot of money over the years on gargantuan evaluations. So we have the big teen pregnancy prevention evaluation, and soon we'll have the home visiting evaluation. Do you buy into this idea that maybe if you had more flexibility in paying for smaller evaluations, perhaps that taken together would do something like that? Do you think that that's worth exploring more?
Absolutely.
Because, wait, I want to point out to the audience, those were required in the legislation. You did not have much flexibility. So if the legislation says you've got to do this, so this is requiring some influence with the Congress.
So the answer to your question is yes. So first off, yes, we still do big evaluations where we want to understand how an entire program or a type of intervention works. Typically, we don't do an evaluation of a program as a whole unless Congress makes us. My own opinion is that those evaluations don't give as much useful information as you might think. If you find out that the impact of a whole program is X, it's really not so obvious what the next steps are in order to improve it. So, for example, in the statutorily required evaluation of the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting program, we designed that evaluation in such a way that we will be able to answer many more questions than just the average impact of the program as a whole. We want to understand how features of design, of program design and implementation are associated with evaluations. And one that will give a lot more information for program improvement, and that kind of more nuanced evaluation that incorporates many different questions means that you are going to get interesting and useful information regardless of what the overall findings are. Because you don't want, it's great if you do an evaluation and you find out a program has strong impacts. Often we do evaluations and find out that a program doesn't have strong impacts, and you don't want to just be left with, oh, well, okay, null impacts, what are we going to do next? So if you look at how variation in implementation or approach is associated with impacts, then you're going to have interesting information. We also are doing a lot more evaluations in the style of rapid cycle evaluations, where we tweak some small aspect of program implementation or design and see what are the impacts on proximate outcomes. So not necessarily the ultimate outcomes of employment or avoidance of teen pregnancy, but more short-term outcomes such as program attendance. So, for example, in our Building Bridges and Bonds evaluation of responsible fatherhood programs, we're looking at things like whether text reminders can lead to more faithful attendance at the program, which presumably more attendance will improve eventual outcomes. So we are kind of doing the whole spectrum. We have a project that we call BIAS, BIAS, building, well, anyway, something about advancing self-sufficiency, behavioral interventions to advance self-sufficiency, which is making behaviorally informed small changes to mostly state-administered programs in the areas of child support, child care, and TANF. And we found, I believe, in 13 out of 16 of those tests, we got positive, significant impacts, which is really unheard of. So these smaller, quicker evaluations can be fun and exciting and cheap.
Great. Other questions? Right here.
Hi, this question is for Tim. I was intrigued to hear that you're going to be building stakeholder input into the next iteration of your learning agenda, and I was wondering whether you've thought about how you will balance what it is that your stakeholders want versus what you need and can support with your capacity.
The short answer is no. I haven't thought of that yet, because we were just talking about this the other day about going out and who are the right stakeholders to reach out to, and because I want a broad scope, but then we haven't yet talked about how we're going to incorporate the feedback we receive into what we ultimately publish as our learning agenda.
Great. Right here in the back.
Hi, I'm a librarian, and I'm concerned about the incorporation of third-party and outside government resources doing research, because the data that's coming from the federal government is a part of the public domain. And so if the results or the data sets that are coming out of this third-party or non-governmental research, is that going to be put back into the public domain, not just the research reports, but also the data associated with that, so other researchers could use that data?
Who wants to take a stab? Go ahead.
So I'll say that for us, we plan on publishing them. We set up an evaluation portal on our website within our performance group, where we have all of our performance reports, and the research that's published by a university is also going to appear on there as well. So we made a point of that.
Data sets.
Well, and the data sets, we're not.
That have been stripped out of privacy and security issues.
So, and the question was, and the data sets that have been stripped of the privacy and security issues. We hadn't thought about publishing the data sets themselves as much as the report, of showing the report and what data that they used. That in some cases, as I was saying, in some cases, like the research study combining insurance data, that's not even data that we have. So therefore, we're not able to publish that.
So we do generally archive the data from our studies for secondary use, sometimes with different tiers of availability. So there might be a public use data set that has all the private information stripped. There might be a restricted use data set with more information available that can be made available to researchers who are willing to go through certain hoops.
Maybe a couple, well, one more question based on the time. Right here.
Thank you. I wanted to build on this question. It was a question that I had when I was listening to Mrs. Weichert and Mr. Gribben here. What do you do about when you're sharing government data with the private sector about them potentially monetizing that data, and that either you down the road, this is a little bit different than the public domain of the data sets, but what we know about data now is that everything is monetizable, and the old line about if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. But what do you do about them monetizing it down the road, and then either you, the government, having to pay for it again after it's been adapted, or the taxpayer having to pay it again through purchasing private sector products from that data?
So this may not be the right answer, but I'll give it a try. Private sector monetizes things that the government makes available for free all the time. So there, you can go on Amazon and pay money for reports that you can go on our website and download for free. So I don't think we can stop the private sector from doing that, but we do still have ownership of the things that we've paid to produce, and so we have the free use of those assets and can make those assets available to other people for free as well.
Yeah, and I know we have data that's been monetized, but it's also data that's available that you don't actually have to pay for the same way. Like, you can get a lot of the data that some people pay for free off of usaspending.gov. But we have looked at what we try to do is we, as part of the Small Business Week this past year, we hosted a hackathon, which was really more of how to create APIs that would access government data, whether it's SBA data or others that's currently available, in a way that you could, someone in the private sector could use and access the data in a better way than maybe they can just by downloading off of a website. So those are the things that we're doing to try to look at, well, how can we make our data more accessible? And then we also look at, when we get requests for our data, is it a high-value data set that we should publish in on open government so that there's an interest in some data set that we weren't even aware of. So we look at it from all those perspectives, but I would add on to say that is what the private sector does, is monetize government data, and that's never really going to change.
So as the private sector person on the panel, do you, so it's okay to not answer this question, but.
No, so I totally agree with that statement. I mean, so disclaimer, our company doesn't sell product, we sell research capabilities. But I think it's absolutely true. The private sector will monetize data any chance they get, including data that may be publicly available elsewhere. It always makes sense to be the cautious consumer and try to find that data elsewhere. And the same is true even in scientific research. There's a tremendous amount of research that effectively National Science Foundation, for example, pays for, but then it gets monetized in the form of pay sites to retrieve research papers. So it's what the world is. It's what the world's going to continue to be. I think consumers can make the right choice and often find that data elsewhere where it's not a paywall.
That's one thing I saw. And I also don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, because people consume data in different ways, and you can buy it in the way that you want it to be consumed, and with some analytics that's put behind it that the government doesn't have the resources to do. So I think it's a good thing, and I think, but the other part of it is that we also look at when data is consumed in a different way. Are they using the right business rules? Are they drawing the right conclusions? And if that's not, that's where we look to make sure that there isn't inaccurate data being reported.
So I think that's a good note to end on. I just want to say thank you to each of you for all of the work you're doing, whether it's ACF, SBA, or working with a number of federal agencies to really lead the charge on some of these important issues that the Commission had recommendations about, as Ron noted. So thank you all, and let's give the panelists a round of applause. I'd like to now invite Bruce Meyer to the stage. Bruce is also a former member of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, and he's going to talk about some of his innovative research around income data.
Thank you. So I think of my talk as the second academic research interlude in the program, which seems entirely appropriate, hopefully not a time to relax and reflect. And following Ken, I want to emphasize that it's great to have the Commission staff here and be with them along with fellow commissioners, the groups that work so hard on the report. I'm going to describe a project that's joint with academic and census researchers. Amy O'Hara should be listed as Georgetown on this. And what the project is, it's called the Comprehensive Income Dataset Project, and we affectionately call it the KID. And the idea behind the KID is to bring together 3 sources of data to look at income-related issues and program receipt-related issues. And the project combines survey data with a random sample of the population and rich demographic information, and a flexible platform to which you can add and subtract questions. And it combines those data with tax data that also have broad coverage, especially with information returns, and great accuracy. And the third source that we use is program data, which you need if you're going to evaluate programs. what we want to do with this KID is improve Census Bureau surveys, enhance tax administration, and provide better information to examine public policies and support research. The reason that we need to combine these three sources of data are that each of the data sources, survey, tax, program, alone are inadequate. The main problem with survey data, I would say, is that people are increasingly unwilling to answer surveys and answer them accurately. Let me show you some numbers on this. It's a little hard to read, but if you look at the row labeled CPS and you look across it, what those numbers indicate is the share of the benefits that the government paid out for a given program that weren't reported in the survey. So if you look across the CPS row, that's the current population survey, our main source of income data, the first two numbers indicate that 50% of TANF dollars don't appear in the survey, and almost 42% of SNAP or food stamp dollars don't appear in the survey. So you have a real problem looking at income at the bottom or program receipt if you just use survey data. Tax data, great advantages, but you lack demographic information like education and race. Program data have very limited information besides what's used to administer the program. So what we do in this project is we bring together data from several household surveys, tax data, and then data from federal programs from the Social Security Administration, HUD, HHS, and then data from state programs, or at least state-administered programs, so TANF and SNAP and WIC. And that's what we have done so far. We have plans to bring in additional data from the Veterans Administration that we're working on, and to bring in more data from the states. Currently, what we have in the way of data from the states is quite limited because what we have is what the states have supplied to the Census Bureau sort of on an ad hoc basis. So currently, for example, we only have about 15 states data for SNAP and less than that for WIC, and only a couple for the LIHEAP program. Now we put these data sources together using what's called a protected identification key, which is an anonymized version of the Social Security number, so that researchers are not looking at any personally identifiable information. What will we do with these data? Well, the idea is to improve surveys, because when you bring these data sources together, you can determine the extent and nature of errors in the surveys. You can improve the imputation of missing values, because there are a lot of responses that aren't given in surveys, and those responses need to be statistically imputed. One can substitute the potentially more accurate administrative values for survey reports, and that can allow survey designers to drop questions that they previously had to ask people, so it can reduce the burden on the public. And the data can be used to augment surveys and add information that you wouldn't otherwise have. In terms of improving tax administration and policy making, examples of what you could use these data for to analyze EITC take-up of the Earned Income Tax Credit. That's something that's already going on. And the IRS is interested in using these data to look at areas, not individuals, but types of returns where there's non-compliance. One of the most important uses of the data, I suspect, will be forecasting and simulating changes in taxes and government programs. Now, in terms of research, this data set would be the ideal source to look at poverty, inequality, and other features of the income distribution, and to estimate the effects of social insurance and mean-tested programs. I'm going to quickly describe two good examples of projects that we've done as proofs of concept with these data. There are many cases where people want to look at the poverty reduction due to social insurance or means-tested transfers. And there's a long literature doing this. Now, a problem with doing it with survey data alone, which is the standard way, is that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the people that are receiving government transfers, means-tested or social insurance, don't report it in the survey. In addition, you want to know where people are starting in terms of their income and to see the extent of poverty reduction. And if you're missing many sources of income, then you're not going to have even a good starting point for looking at the poverty reduction of a given program. So what we did is we took the survey of income and program participation, which is really a best case scenario for using survey data to look at the poverty reduction of various programs, because the survey of income and program participation in the form that we use it here no longer exists. It's been changed from a survey that interviews people 3 times a year to a survey that interviews people once. What this figure shows is the ratio of the poverty reduction that you would come up with if you use the survey compared to what you get when you use the combined survey and administrative data. A number or a dot here to the left means that you've understated the poverty reduction to the program of the program. A marker to the right indicates that you've overstated the extent. And here we show it for 4 different programs for a number of different types of families. And what you'll see, say, focusing on the row for single mothers, you'll see that for 3 of the 4 programs, you quite dramatically understate, if you just use the survey information, the extent of poverty reduction from the programs. So that's true here for all of the programs except for SNAP. The other 3 are quite dramatically understated. You'll also notice that there are a number of triangles to the right of one, and that means that the poverty reduction of SSI in the survey is usually overstated. And that's because many people are confusing SSI, supplemental security income, with OASDI, which is Social Security, retirement, and disability benefits. Second example, there's been a lot of work looking at the extent of what's called extreme poverty. Most commonly, it's defined as the share of people living on less than $2 a day. There was recently a UN Human Rights Commission report that echoed some of these findings. One of the most commonly cited numbers is that 4% of households with children are living on less than $2 a day. And that kind of number was echoed by this UN report. Now, you might, just reflecting, think that a lot of those numbers might come from errors in the data, because if people aren't reporting various kinds of income, that could make it seem like a large share of people are actually living on almost nothing. What we did is we took the survey data from the SIP, and we implemented various corrections to the data. And a number of them, I will admit, we just could do within the survey without using administrative data. For example, there are a lot of people in the survey who report that they worked, they report hours, they report a lot of other characteristics of the job, they say they worked for pay, but they just don't bother to report the earnings. And some past researchers naively have just said, you know, their earnings are zero. So we implement those corrections, but what is nice, we implement a series of corrections. This shows what happens as you implement various corrections to the data, and it shows it for various kinds of families. And what is especially useful about having the administrative data is that you can then confirm that, say, those people who didn't report any earnings but reported hours, you can then go to the tax data and see if they did in fact have earnings. So while we implement most of these corrections using just the survey data, we can then confirm them with the administrative data, but the administrative data on program receipt and taxes are used for the last couple steps that indicate that there really are very few households actually getting by on $2 a day, but there is a substantial share of single individuals, that's the yellow squares, who we can't rule out are living on almost nothing. So those are two examples of what you could do with these data. We hope that the Census Bureau will adopt this as a regular program in the future. And in terms of where the commission fits in, I should emphasize that it took about 15 years of work of trying to assemble the data to get to where we are here. And I expect that we'll be at this for another 5 or 10 more years. The data currently aren't that comprehensive, even though we call it the comprehensive income data set, in part because we don't have much of the data from states that we would like to include, and we would like access to these data to be more uniform, more, we would like researchers besides myself and my co-authors to be able to access the data, and the commission recommends a process that would make that feasible. Thank you.
So as Bruce indicated at the end, This work is incredibly difficult and is a good suggestion for just why the Commission's recommendations are actually needed to make it so this doesn't take 15 plus another 10 years to get this kind of research. I'd like to invite our last panel to the stage. The panel will be moderated by Shelley Martinez. For those of you not familiar with Shelley, Shelley was the Executive Director of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, and she will introduce you to the panel.
Thanks, Nick. So I was going to introduce myself. Thank you for doing that. My day job is at the Office of Management and Budget, and I work with Margaret on some of the data strategy that she made reference to today. And we've heard a lot so far this morning about what's been happening over the past year, some of the exciting things at agencies and academic research and so forth. And this panel is going to talk a little bit about where we go next. So these are 4 of our commissioners from the Commission. To my immediate left is Bob Groves, Provost of Georgetown University, Robert Shea from Grant Thornton, Sherry Gleed, Dean at NYU, and Robert Hahn, who has many, many affiliations. I think Oxford is the one I'll go with right now. Okay. To start, and I know Nick has talked to you all about kind of the fact that we want to focus this panel on what do we want to do next? Where do we want to focus next? We've got a lot of good things going. What's the right place to focus next? And as you all know well, one of the major areas of focus for the Commission's report was recommendation of a National Secure Data Service, or NSDS, which we'll probably lapse into for the next little while. So the first question for all of you, and I'd like all of you to just to talk about this, is given that it's been a year, do you still think NSDS is needed? And if so, how would it improve evidence building in your corner of the world? I'm going to start with Sherry. Sherry's focus is health policy. So what about health?
I'm the non-Bob on the panel.
That's right. You're the only person whose name is in
Well, we could change that.
Don't call me Bob.
In a perfect world, right?
So first of all, I would like to say that absolutely the NSDS is still needed. And in health policy, I was thinking about it on my way over here today. One of the things that has really been a big development in health policy, even over the last 5 years, but increasingly over time, is the recognition that healthcare policy has to be connected with lots of other systems. And you can see that in a lot of different ways. One is, say, around the social determinants of health. How do we think about housing policy and health policy together? One is about things like Medicaid work requirements. If we ask people, if we condition having Medicaid on going to work, we're basically connecting these systems. One is around management and administrative issues, like how can we get people to sign up for health insurance? What are the best ways of actually making that happen? So healthcare is actually a really interesting area in terms of the NSDS because there has been a really robust research effort in the health space. I mean, Medicare and Medicaid data are available to people and people use them. I think it's actually a beautiful illustration of how having an appropriate administrative security infrastructure can actually enable research to happen. You really safeguard privacy and you unleash a lot of research potential. But now I think that research has to go beyond just the healthcare data to thinking about those interactions among programs. And to do that, there needs to be a vehicle where the data can be safely and securely linked. And I think the NSDS would be the way to do that.
Bob Hahn.
Sure.
Speaking about the regulatory space.
Shelley, it's great to have you asking the questions, and now you really expect us to answer them, which is
That's right.
bizarre.
Tables are sometimes turned, right?
Yeah.
Briefly, Bob.
That's impossible
You
for
all
an Oxford professor.
are getting a window into how much fun we had for 15 months.
I wanted to maybe answer your question, but follow up on a phrase that Ken Trotsky used earlier, which is continuous improvement. So I think the real reason we need the NSDS, and I can't remember now what the acronym stands for, but the real reason we need a data service is to lower the costs of doing the kinds of work that Ken eloquently presented this morning and Bruce presented. So for example, I ran something before I ran off to Oxford called the AEI Brookings Joint Center. And we routinely analyzed a bunch of regulations in the federal government, some from health, some from the environment, some from safety, some from transport, and the alphabet soup of independent agencies that many of you are familiar with. And we had very limited data on which to do these analyses. We tried to do back of the envelope benefit cost analyses before the fact. But if we actually could burrow in as researchers and look at how regulations progressed over time. So I'm thinking, for example, there was a lead regulation about a decade ago to reduce air quality lead emissions. If we could get access to some of the enforcement actions, to some of the emissions data, to some of the health data, I think it would be possible to substantially improve the analyses on which decision makers base their decision. Now, I think it's a separate, so I do think the data center is a really good idea, and I think a data center that adequately protects privacy is an absolute, and that was part of what the commission, I think, agreed to. The next big question I would ask is the Oxford professor, or whatever affiliation I have today, is how do you get the folks on Capitol Hill or folks in the agencies to take this seriously and also make it their own? So my wife, when I told her that I was going to serve on this august commission for a year and a half, she said, well, what are you going to do? And I said, well, we're going to you know, because I had to schlep back and forth between the UK and the US. And I said, well, we're going to try to make it easier for decision makers to use evidence when they're making big decisions. And she comes out of a public health background, and she goes, that's very interesting. What do they do now? Sorry, Robert, for that.
Okay, I guess, Robert, you have the baton then.
So, you know, I think we've heard a lot of stories about the great things that are going on, but we also heard Tim and Naomi talk about the statutory, regulatory, bureaucratic barriers to doing this. I remember vividly Naomi and Demetra Nightingale testifying about this at one of our hearings, and fought to have it featured in the report that most don't understand. Trying to get the talent, trying to procure the resources, get access to the data, protect privacy, the kind of hoops you have to jump through to do this. The National Secure Data Service could be the place at which all these barriers are resolved, at least to the extent possible, so that there's best practices in contracting, recruitment and retention of the right people, data access protections, linking data sources, all of those things could be done at a one-stop shop. So I think that really is, to me, one of the great promises of being able to unlock the kind of evidence that really was the foundation for the commission.
Maybe I'll call myself Robert.
Don't confuse.
So, I mean, just looking at this room, there's so many people in this room that have been plugging away at this problem for decades. So I think the first thing that comes to mind just looking at familiar faces is we wouldn't be in this business if we were in for quick returns, right? We're all glass half full people, or, you know, we're in the wrong profession. You know, we're all disappointed that 2 houses of the legislature didn't pass this, but so my reflections from a statistical system viewpoint is, if you look, you know, we had 3 sets of recommendations: issues of privacy protection, issues of access, and issues of building the infrastructure. And you could sort of comment on each of these. We knew, I think many of us knew, on the privacy side, we were right on the edge, that work had to be done. The last panel was great to point out that the things we aspire to with regard to increased privacy protections require some research and development. And you know, the good news is that's happening. It's probably not happening at the rate that would happen if the data service were up and running, but it's happening. On the access side, we're still plagued by the bureaucracy of regulatory constraints, and we heard again that hasn't gotten better. I remind us of my favorite sentence in the legislation, that the NSDS would have the authority to acquire administrative data for statistical uses. There are people in this room that have been fighting for this for 40 years, and we've never even had it in a piece of legislation, I think. So I'm still waiting for that one. But there's another part of access that you've also heard, and that is there's a bunch of technical stuff on how do we blend data together once we get it. And that's a 10-year run, in my belief. A lot of technical work, nitty-gritty model contrasts and diagnostics and so on. And that's going ahead. Again, probably not at the rate that should. I cite and give a shout out to Lucas and others who worked on a Federal Committee of Statistical Methodology Big Data Day, where the federal agencies people working in the vineyards of statistics presented work they're doing, most of it below the radar, on how to blend data together. And that's great. And I hope, and I think we all hope, that maybe the Commission helped in some mild way to let them do that work, to give them leave to try out and experiment and doing really unnatural things for federal agencies that will pave the way forward. So on all of these things, on the infrastructure side, the SBA and other comments are neat. Again, below the radar, agencies can do some things, and that's great, and it warms my heart that there's a possibility that the commission helped on that.
So Bob Grove's remarks began to get into some of the work that would need to be done to think about addressing these challenges that take many years to accomplish, and how the NSDS could contribute to certain pieces of that. Can you all talk just a little bit about, when we spilled a lot of ink in the report on NSDS, and yet many details were to be determined. And I heard each of you emphasize slightly different functions or capacities or roles that NSDS could play. Talk a little bit about how you'd like to see that process of developing and fleshing out the NSDS look. What are some things you'd like to see in that process? Robert, why don't we start with you this time?
Well, where's it going to go? What authorities will it have? We saw enormous variety of examples of how different jurisdictions were tackling this problem. Mm-hmm. Some of them pretty Star Wars-like, providing very secure facilities in which to access the data. Those things need to be worked out, but you can do a lot of laying the groundwork between now and then to identifying the kinds of sharing of best practices that need to be done to get there. Agencies are doing a lot of this already, and so whether you begin to do this virtually in advance of it being done technically or statutorily, someone's going to have to take the lead for that. Margaret is advancing a lot of great concepts in improving the management of the executive branch. But her discussion took a very broad view of what evidence is. And I think the National Secure Data Service takes both a narrower view and a more ambitious one. We really do want to isolate the impact of what we're doing from other factors as quickly and as cheaply as possible, so that we can begin to reform those programs so they are having a bigger, better actual impact.
Sherry.
So I think one of the things we actually have to do is explain to people what we're talking about, because I think one of the big challenges in moving forward is that the people in this room think a lot about this stuff, and we understand what we're talking about. But for most people, when you say that you want to build a national secure data service, I have an image in my mind. Nick has heard me say it. So have any of you seen the movie 2001, The Space Odyssey? Mm-hmm. I think most people think that NSDS is that monolith that has all the information about everybody in one big black building somewhere in the desert. And I think even many of us came in with something of that conception, and we wound up in a very different place. But we wound up there after a year and a half of talking to one another, and I think it's not surprising that most people still haven't gotten there. So I actually think there's a lot of work for us all to be doing, just in educating people into the whole idea of what it means for the NSDS to exist, for for linkages among data sets to happen only as a temporary measure, for the data to be confidential, to not actually be centralized in that way. This is a very different concept. This is like data, national NSDS 2, version 2, Gen 2 or something. And it doesn't help that the technical aspects of it are very complicated. I mean, you put up that slide earlier that showed okay, I work in this world, and I still can't imagine what does it mean to encrypt something one way and the other way and put it together. So I think we actually have a job ahead of us of just helping people to understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, I agree with what everyone has said, and I'm not going to answer your question. I'm going to answer a different question, or suggest a different agenda.
This is bringing back memories of the commission.
Let me say this about that.
15 months to do a report.
So I think Sherry's absolutely right that we've got to explain what the concept is and why it's not 2001 or some version of 2001 that's showing at your nearest cinema in 2018 or on your iPhone. But I also think the biggest challenge we have as a group, and by revealed preference the folks who showed up today, is to really convince the broader community of the value of this effort. And I think we have to do that, or we can do that by putting forward the kinds of research that Bruce and Ken and others in the room are doing, and particularly research that is going to address the concerns of vulnerable populations which people can relate to, whether it's low-income individuals, people who are barely making it on $3 a day or what have you, and really get those kinds of stories out and illustrate when you have access, when researchers have access to better kinds of information, we can develop new and better insights to really move the ball forward. Doesn't matter what party you're a member of.
What question would you like to answer?
Yeah. Well, I have so many different answers to your question, and none of us know how long we'll be in this interim stage of not having legislation. So, if you go down that path, what should we be trying to promulgate without the legislative assist? There are various things that are happening that I see as good signs. So I guess I'm in public print saying that the president's proposal to move BLS into commerce is a good thing. I think that is synergistic with the NSDS notion. It's a completely different idea, but it isn't harmful to NSDS, and so I think that's a good thing. What that means isn't at all clear. There's work going on by private foundations to create a new field that they want to call public interest technology. I think that's a great thing. Imagine a whole generation of computer scientists who are doing this for common good purposes rather than maximizing the fit of a click model for pop-up ads. And so they're talking about new curricula that, not unlike the creation of public interest law about 40 years ago, right? Every law school now has a public interest law component. So that's a good thing, right? One of our problems on infrastructure is how do you get a computer scientist to work for federal government wages? Well, you need a set of values to support that. So I'm hopeful about those things. So I think in this interim period, we should just be grasping at every little thing that's synergistic with the idea in order to get the infrastructure kind of ready. And when the law is passed, we're ready to roll.
Do you want to comment on the other branch of your tree there, if you were speaking to
if you go down the other, well, then, okay. If we went down that other line, I think we all, or at least I, speaking for one commission member, there's a lot to work out on what this thing means. Let's say we have the legislation and boom, there is an advisory group to plan it out. Well, there are a lot of things to work out here. And although we were hopeful that you could build an environment with a technical staff that was on the cutting edge, that was a hope. I mean, if imagine all of us being given the mandate to that. That's a toughie. That's hard. The details of if you're going to create this unit, how are you going to fund the unit, and if it is in commerce, which was an idea that we spent a lot of time talking about, then there are things to do inside commerce that aren't particularly easy and have been problematic for decades. So there's a lot of just nitty-gritty bureaucratic work, in a good sense, I mean, bureaucratic, designing the organizational structure, lines of authority, who does what. But the technical staff, I think, is a critical path for NSDS.
So Bob kind of started us down the thought process of what are all those building block pieces that we can be highlighting and drawing attention to build towards an NSDS. But the report obviously had many other recommendations and things related to NSDS that, as you've noted, can happen separate from a new organization. So I'm going to give all of you just a chance to sort of pick one thing that you think would be something you would, if you were king for a day, what would you like us all to be focusing on over the next year? What's a specific thing that you would get excited about focusing on? I'm gonna have Bob Hahn go not first because you're gonna answer different questions. So. How about Bob? Can I pick on you, Bob Groves?
Oh, okay. Let's see. The one thing I guess I would try. I truly believe that what we were opining on with regard to privacy protections is really important, and I think it may be the route to better support to get the bills through. So taking up Sherry's point, articulating that in plain English and how we truly believe there are a set of emerging tools that can protect our existing data better than we're protecting them. That is, there is a benefit of this alone, and the NSDS is the way to that. Has a route worth taking, because if we get the plain English discussion of this, it has other benefits for what we're trying to do. So I think I'd probably work on that.
You know, we're talking as if the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policy Act actually creates the National Secure Data Service, and it does not do that. It actually took a crack at some of our least controversial recommendations, one of which was establishing chief evaluation officers at agencies. You've got a management infrastructure in place in agencies today, a chief financial officer, a chief information officer, a chief human capital officer. Those officials aren't really asking whether what we're doing is working. So I think the chief evaluation officer can drive the learning agenda that many agencies are creating to do. It can institutionalize a lot of the best practices in this arena by having a single belly button in charge of establishing the learning agenda. What are the big questions that these organizations need to have answered, and then figuring out the best way to get those questions answered and driving those answers into the policymaking process.
So I'd actually pick up on exactly that. I mean, I think that it's probably wrong to think that if you build it, they will come. That if you simply put the NSDS in place, all of a sudden people will change the way they've been doing business entirely and become consumers of data and manage, doing total quality improvement all the time. And conversely, if a real spirit of evaluation and continuous quality improvement pervaded the agencies, there would be that in itself would push the agenda to build an NSDS. So these things are actually symbiotic. And people have to learn to ask questions. It's not a natural thing if you run an organization to think about what questions you could ask, let alone how you'd find the answers to them. So I think actually pushing on that learning agenda, chief evaluation officer idea is really something we should be doing.
So I'm going to surprise you and answer your question. I think Robert and the rest of the panel are absolutely correct. You need to think about catalysts that will encourage agencies to adopt evidence-based policy making, and an evaluation officer is a great idea. I think we also need to give serious thought to how we frame this discussion, and Bob Groves touched on that, and this is something you might have heard me say on the commission when we were discussing things, but I think there's a potential win-win here, okay? We can do privacy protections much better than what we're doing now and get much better public policy insights. And I'd like to see elected officials pushing that. I'd like to see interested citizens like ourselves pushing that and using the mantra of win-win. And let me give you an example that's completely unrelated to this, but I played a small role in, and that was the 1990 Clean Air Act. So when then President Bush came in and was elected, he said, I'm going to do something about addressing acid rain. I don't know how many people in the room remember the phrase acid rain. And what he did was he developed a market-based approach for reducing sulfur dioxide emissions, essentially cutting them in half. And we used the rhetoric, which was true, of win-win. It was a win for the environment and a win for the economy. So I do think we need to think a little bit about rhetoric as we move forward over the next year. And I tried to stay in the lane as much as I could.
Well done. So I'm going to segue from what Bob Hahn just said back to you for a minute, Bob Groves. You made reference to the...
Call me Sherry, please.
Oh, okay. On a bad day, I might just do that by accident. You mentioned the proposal that would move the BLS to the Commerce Department, which of course is part of thinking about the federal statistical system and particularly the three agencies that produce our economic statistics and kind of how we could improve their ability to produce high-quality statistics. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who's been a leader in the statistical system, what's the best thing we can be doing to ensure trust in federal data and federal statistics, which of course are the fuel to build evidence?
Complicated question, and I really don't know the answer, but I think about it a lot. I think trust requires, or trust is most easily attained in organizations that have a pretty focused mission. Because I think trust is based on the stakeholders' view about whether the organization is fulfilling the mission. If you have a greatly dispersed mission, it's hard to win on all those things. Secondly, I think there is a long-held memory of institutional violation of the mission. So honesty, I think, is really important, and since honesty is important at a time of crisis, transparency becomes important during stable times. So I think transparency is really increasingly important, because if a crisis happens or if data are hacked, and the reaction of the organization is to close up, that's what we've all been through, right? Now, the statistical agencies and the NSDS, remember what the proposal on NSDS was, to have sort of radical transparency. Better transparency than the Census Bureau has or BLS has or any existing statistical agency, to be open on methods and products. And so you would know, if all of our recommendations were fulfilled, what data are being blended together for what purpose and what the results of that blending was. And we were committed to that. I think trust comes from that. And then the final thing about trust that I really do believe is you can't build trust in a week. So trust is a long-term perceived relationship between us and some organization. And so the tough thing about the NSDS is it will be a new organization. It will have no track record. It would have no set of reciprocal relationships with stakeholders on day one, and hence doesn't deserve trust immediately. And that's a problem with that particular new unit. Making it affiliated with the statistical system is probably a good idea. That was our idea, to kind of borrow some of the trust of those other agencies. I still think that's a good idea, but if anyone does know how to, what are the mechanisms for generating public trust, I'd love to talk to you.
Anybody else want to comment on the issue of building trust?
Well, you talked about. I think building is the wrong word. It's restoring, because there's, we do have a good historical record of the degree to which Americans trust their government generally to do the right thing, and that's been on the decline, and it's at its lowest point since that measurement's been taken. But there are a lot of things that I'm rooting for. One of the provisions, someone asked about data sets being transparent. The Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking creates the presumption that data in the hands of the government or provided to the government, with some exceptions, is made public. There's also the federal financial management community is reorienting an enormous set of resources which currently are invested in improving financial reporting into all reporting. So that's I risk taking an arcane conversation to a lower level of arcana. But I think that's something worth watching, this attention being focused on the integrity of what we report both internally and externally could dramatically improve the degree to which people trust the information that the government's reporting. I think, I talk about restoring trust in government generally. The statistical community does enjoy a lot of trust. I think what Bruce talked about is maybe some of that's misplaced, but that can also contribute to the strengthening of that foundation.
Others?
So I was going to ask Nick to put earplugs in his ears for a minute, but I was going to elevate this question, about 10,000 feet. I still think we need to make the case broadly for evidence-based policy. And I think the work of the BPC is, as we might say in Britain, spot on in doing that, which is why I wanted the earplugs in. But seriously, I think unless we can make that case, it's quite likely that many institutions, whether they're trusted now or new, are going to be under siege. And that's the agenda I would like to see us pursuing.
And I'm just struck by how much data private sector purveyors collect on us all the time, and we don't get upset about it. And the reason is, I think, often because we believe it's being used, that there is something coming back to us that seems obvious and useful to us. And so I think connecting the use of the data with what we do with it and why it makes your life better could help build that trust.
Right. Well, yes, you all can't see, but the countdown went to 0 right when Sherry finished talking. So I think that's my cue to open the floor for questions. I think folks have mics. I see someone here in the center. Okay, there you go.
Hi, thank you all very much. Very interesting. My name is Mindy Reiser. I'm a sociologist. I've worked in different parts of the world and for many different U.S. government agencies. So my question is this. We have folks here, some of you are based abroad now, some of you have certainly worked abroad. I'd like to take this to a bit of a comparative basis and ask, let's say, in some of the social democracies that still exist, although maybe limping, and have national health plans and other social services. What have they done in terms of aggregating data? What can we learn from that? We also know that the EU is very concerned about privacy. So I think there are a number of lessons. Has the Commission looked into this? If not, somebody should, and I'd like to hear your remarks.
Who would, anyone? Sherry's nodding. You made eye contact.
We actually had presentations from several of the countries that run statistical data systems, and the Commission did actually look into this quite a bit. So there were, as one might imagine, there are considerable variations among countries in how they collect and use data, and I think picking up on on Robert's point, they are very closely connected with people's confidence in government and in security. Also, many of those social democracies are much, much smaller than the United States, which is a non-trivial consideration. So I would say, yes, we definitely did look at it. We talk about it some in the commission report, and there are definitely lessons that we can learn, both, I think, in terms of the structure of these things, but also there were a lot of technical questions here that other countries have been struggling with as well, and that we can learn from.
So there's one fantastic difference. I don't know what countries you're thinking about, and I'm with Sherry on there's a lot of variation, but many of our European colleagues live in countries where there is a central statistical law that governs a central bureau of statistics, giving the rights of acquisition of data from any government, central or local, to that agency. And so the access issue has been eliminated in those countries through that legal structure. We just don't have it. All of the other things, I think the blending issues and evidence-based policy are culturally based as opposed to legally based, but we have a big legal impediment to us. We're starting the race way behind.
Other questions? I see one over there. Oh, okay. Well, okay, we'll go here. Okay, we'll go here. Lady in pink and black.
How might the Bipartisan Policy Center, all of you who participated in this project, how might we get those stories out there or circulated so that we can help those who can help this effort understand why it's so important and see the benefit of it?
So for those who missed the very first part of Mary's comment was just the importance of data stories and stories to help elevate the importance of some of the commission's work. Who would like to?
I mean, I just want to reinforce what I've heard from Bob and Sherry, and to some extent you, Bob, that we need to make sure people know what we're talking about. Because it is, after 20 years of working in this vineyard, getting people to understand what you mean by performance, results, outcomes, evidence. It's all it's somewhat intuitive. But people confuse simple performance with accomplishing an outcome and performance data with evidence. And I find that you have to hammer those messages home all the time. We've heard some great stories today about both what access to data can do and the difficulty in getting there. And I just think repetition is in order. And y'all are educators. Can you instruct us on
not
how to...
My answer to you would be, I thought we heard just wonderful stories in the testimony, and with careful editing, skills that I don't have, those could be portrayed as just wonderfully powerful messages that if you free up data for common good purposes, good things can result. Many of them are local. I think that's probably a good thing right now rather than having a national example in today's climate. So I bet we could get a score of these that would really be powerful. So it's a great idea.
Yeah, there's some stories in the report, but I was going to make a slightly different point, which is some people are worried because you do a lot of these program evaluations, and I think Margaret touched on this earlier, and find that they don't work or you can't find an effect. So you need to think about when you're designing your evaluation, how you can design it in a way that can shed insight on how you can improve these programs. And I think that's a point we want to make. And,
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Actually, this is for you, Ms. Martinez. I'm very inspired.
It's out of order, but no, go ahead.
I'm very inspired by what OMB is taking on, the federal statistical data. in policies and seeing data as a national asset. And I'm wondering, do you know how much of the commission report, I hope, will be feeding a lot of those concepts?
Thanks for the question. So I have a colleague in the audience right in front of you smiling because she's also helping me with that work at OMB. The commission report is a very essential input to that work. And Margaret didn't use slides today, but if she had, we would have put up, we do have a website and we have opportunities for public feedback. So to the extent that the data strategy that the federal government is developing is a broader scope than evidence building, but evidence building is a central part. So if you all can remember, strategy.data.gov is our website, and there's information about some more specific details than Margaret was able to go into today, and opportunities for the public to give us feedback on some products that we're putting out each quarter. So we welcome that participation. And I didn't mean to do a commercial at the end, but I think that'll be our final word on the panel.
Yeah, so now we have to cut you off for giving a commercial, but thank you to the Bobs and to Sherry and to Shelley for the great panel. So to close out our discussion this morning, I'd like to invite the chair of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking and the co-chair of our initiative here at BPC, Catherine Abraham, to the stage.
Great, thank you, Nick. I actually found the presentations today to be truly inspiring. I really did. We heard on the first panel from some exciting things that are going on within federal agencies. We've all known Naomi for a long time, and ACF has really been at the forefront of trying to bring evidence to bear on making policy decisions. But I also was, so maybe I take you for granted, Naomi. So I was particularly inspired by Tim's comments about the things that he's been able to do at SBA, which is not an agency where this has been embedded in the agency's DNA for a long period of time. And I guess what I took from those presentations was the importance to making change with respect to evidence-based policymaking of leadership on the ground, and also of how much a committed leader can accomplish, even without some of the recommendations of the commission having been implemented. I thought the presentations that Ken and Bruce gave were great in terms of what access to data can do in terms of helping us better understand what's going on in the world, better understand the effects of policy on real-world outcomes. And the presentation on the pilot project on multi-party computing and what we can do with trying to improve data access while also strengthening protections for privacy was just terrific. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying that even without all of the Commission's recommendations having been implemented in the form of legislation, there's exciting things that are going on the ground and exciting things that can be done. That said, the comments, the discussion also made very clear that in the present environment, doing some of these things is difficult. I love your comments, Tim, about the searching that you had to do to try to find authorities that would allow these folks out in the private sector who are interested in working with you to actually be able to come in and do it. And you've been really creative, but it shouldn't be the case that everyone who wants to do this has to reinvent the wheel. So it sort of reinforced to me, as did the discussion in the panel that just concluded, of having some kind of a service, a national secure data service. Probably could benefit from a different name if we're thinking in a marketing context, but some kind of entity within the federal government that has as its mission both facilitating access to data and strengthening the protection around the data in terms of how it's being accessed. So I think there's a lot that we can do, but there's clearly things that we also, in the current environment, but clearly some changes in the environment would help with making more of this possible. People have alluded to the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, and it would do some really important things. Robert Shea characterized it as, mainly taking some of the lower hanging fruit from the Commission's recommendations, but it's important things that are included in the act. The thing to me that is the most important, perhaps, in that legislation is it's stating clearly that there's a presumption and that unless there's a legal barrier to doing so, that administrative data should be available for statistical purposes. And I think, in my mind, that's just huge. The recommendations about inventorying the data we have, departments setting up learning agendas, departments having someone to fulfill the chief evaluation officer role, I think are really important. The recommendation about requiring risk assessments before data are pumped out into the public domain is very important. And then the other thing, of course, that this legislation would do is that it would set in motion a process for actually developing what it is that this data service we've been talking about would look like, and I think that's huge as well. So in my mind, getting this legislation passed remains, despite the fact that there's a lot we can do without it, in my mind, getting this legislation passed is really important, and I'm an eternal optimist, and I guess I will just conclude by saying I remain optimistic that that's going to happen. So I am very grateful to all of the presenters and to all of you here in the room who, as others have said, have been working in this vineyard for many years. And I feel like we're making progress. Thank you all.
So just to conclude, thank you all for joining. If you'd like to learn more about the work that we are doing here at the Bipartisan Policy Center, we've got a nice piece that's out on the table in front that summarizes the many things that we've accomplished over the last year. And you can learn more about our ongoing work at bipartisanpolicy.org/evidence. Thank you all for joining, and we look forward to the continued progress.